Hello, everyone. Thanks for joining us for our Lean Startup webcast. Today's topic is Enterprise Transformation, the Lean Startup Way. I'm Sarah Beauvignette, Marketing Manager of Lean Startup Company. Lean Startup Week is less than 3 weeks away. If you're planning on joining us in San Francisco, grab your pass before October 15th to save with our fall sale. Our speaker today is Ries, entrepreneur and author of the New York Times bestseller, The Lean Startup, and his new book, The Startup Way, will be released soon. Moderating is Marilyn Gorman, senior faculty member with Lean Startup Company Education Program. You can catch Eric and Marilyn at Lean Startup Week, where they'll be co-hosting a workshop on the Startup Way on October 31st. Space is limited. If you'd like to participate, it's open to the first 200 Gold Pass holders. You can find more information at 2017.leanstartup.co. A few housekeeping notes. We'll be taking questions from the audience via the live chat. If you'd like to ask a question, please flag it by starting with a Q: before your question. This will be a 45-minute program, and the recording will be available after the live webcast. Take it away, Marilyn.
Okay, thank you so much, Sarah. And hi, Eric, it's great to see you. And thank you so much for sharing your time with us today.
Oh, thank you. It's great to see you again.
It is, thank you. And I'm certainly looking forward to sharing a workshop with you in a few weeks' time at Lean Startup Week.
It brings
Eric,
back some memories of it.
Yeah, it does for sure. Eric, I was lucky enough to have been able to get a proof copy of the book, The Startup Way, but the official launch is only just happening in the next weeks. And so perhaps the best thing we could do to start off is to ask you, what was the background behind you deciding this was the next book to produce? You've dedicated the book to helping businesses, managers, and leaders really head into the challenges of the 21st century, and we all know there are going to be many of them. So how did you know it was time to write The Startup Way? What sparked the need for this?
Well, gosh, I mean, this is a book that is something like 5 years in the making. So I'm very excited finally for it to be out in the world. And for those that are following along at home, its publication date is next Tuesday, October 17th. So get right on it. But and it's surreal because in the book I tried to lay out both the theoretical structure of this new framework of entrepreneurial management that we've worked on together for so long now, and also tell the stories of the work that I have been doing with companies kind of all sizes. I was realizing when speaking to a journalist recently that I've actually done this work now with companies of every order of magnitude of size, from 2 founders in a garage, 20, 200, 2,000, 20,000, 200,000, up to the big, massive federal bureaucracies with like 1 million employees. So like, I've really seen this play out across a wide degree of scales. And why write the book? I mean, if we go back to the Lean Startup, which came out in 2011, I think back on like, why really was I motivated to write the book? And I try to remember what my headspace was like, in 2009, 2010, as I was developing the ideas that would go into the book. One of the things I noticed was that in the early days of talking to people about Lean Startup, people would ask me very simple questions that I struggled to answer. Like, how do you know this is going to work for consumer apps and also enterprise software? And like, what happens if there's science involved, patents involved, trade secrets, legal, all these kind of questions about how to use Lean Startup under various circumstances. How do you do it in a venture-backed company? How do you do it in a bootstrap company, small business, And so the first time you get those kind of questions, they're really interesting. And I spent a lot of time trying to learn, and I worked with a lot of companies together to kind of discover those answers. And then after a couple of years of that, you start to realize you still get the same questions, but now you know the answer. So it starts to get really like not as much fun. It sounds interesting to me. Like, okay, the 50th time you get asked, how do you apply this to enterprise software? You're like, listen, I already answered that question. But of course, the person asking doesn't know that. They weren't in the room when you answered it last week. So that was kind of part of the rationale for me, is like, if I write a book, I can document my thinking once and for all, and then that can reach a lot more people than I can, one person at a time. And hopefully it will prevent people from feeling the need to ask me the basic questions that are answered in the book. And the exact same thing started to happen to me with The Startup Way. The first time we had a conversation about how would you use these concepts to transform a 100-year-old corporation? It was a really interesting question. Now, having done it a couple times, it's not as interesting anymore to me to be asked about it. I mean, I don't mean to sound arrogant about it, but just like, I feel like, I don't know that I have the right answer for all time, but I definitely have my answer, the thing that makes sense to me. And I wanted to like have the chance to lay it out in book length form rather than having to always, walk people through it, because just like Lean Startup, it's a little bit complicated. And I think people have forgotten, because Lean Startup has been so successful and become adopted as conventional wisdom in so many places, people forget that it was quite a departure from the ideas around the time that it was written. I mean, when I first started talking about Lean Startup, people thought I was a little bit crazy. So it's been helpful to kind of go back into that process again and say, look, I think one day we will view this like not as something that needs a book written about it. It's just like a basic fact about how management is conducted. And this is a little bit of a bridge to get us into that world. And so it requires like a little historical perspective, a little theoretical perspective, and lots of case studies to demonstrate how it works.
Yeah, I mean, I love the book because it had all of those examples, and it also had the caveat, if you like, but your company is not necessarily GE or Intuit or, a dozen other large enterprises, hyper-growth companies, whatever. And so we're not here to give you guarantees. You have to test it for yourself, which is also pretty freeing too, I have to say. And I could certainly see the journey, just because what the audience may not know, I was at GE in 2012 when you started working there, and could see the journey in not only what we were doing, but what you were obviously getting a lot smarter at. And that you can see that in the Lean Startup and the Leader's Guide through Kickstarter, and now the Startup Way. So it's been an interesting iteration. How then would you, I'm sure somebody had to write a blurb for your book. What does the Startup Way mean in the simplest possible way? And then maybe we can dig into some of the concepts a little bit.
Yeah, I'm terrible at writing blurbs and summaries. Of course, to me, this is a question that required a book length answer. So if I could have answered it shorter, that's an old Mark Twain story. I would have written you a shorter letter if I'd had time.
Sure.
So yeah, it's a little bit challenging, but the way I would summarize it is like this: both for startups that get past product market fit and for established companies, there's a common problem that they both have that we don't ever talk about, or I think even admit is the same between those two examples. That once a company has multiple products, multiple centers of power, multiple projects going on at the same time, and this can start quite early in the life of a company, given how impactful startups can be these days. There's a real question about who's the entrepreneur now. We're all used to seeing the CEO, the founder CEO, as the entrepreneur, and as the founder CEO myself, I'm used to thinking of myself that way. And yet when you start to scale up, you go through this, it's like a little bit through the looking glass moment, when all of a sudden your job description changes. You're not the entrepreneur. You have to support the entrepreneurs that work for you if you want to be able to do multiple things at the same time and have each of them have that kind of entrepreneurial flavor that startups master. So whether you're 100 years old or 5 years old, whether you have 100 employees or 100,000, it doesn't matter. Somebody has to be in charge of that entrepreneurial type thinking in the organization. And the Startup Way is both a framework and a kind of a very practical set of recommendations about how to transform organizations to be able to do that.
Yeah, I mean, it's wonderfully specific about that. And the other consistency that I've seen in your 3 books is also the Startup Way triangle. That is a huge part of that as well. This idea of accountability as the foundation for everything.
Yeah.
I recently had a conversation with some people in the federal government who said, why can't we get any stickiness when we run open enrollment classes around Lean Startup? And I said, it's really simple, because nobody has to do anything differently. There literally is not the accountability structure in place to support it. So can you talk a little bit about just how you continue to see that as one of the important elements of any company going through transformation, where that triangle fits into it?
Sure. It's really very simple. And it's just a heuristic, a shortcut that I've used over the years to remind myself what causes what in companies, in organizations. And we're so used to focusing on the people and the culture of the organization, we totally forget where those things come from. Like, why do certain kind of people want to work in your organization? People always complain to me, well, we have this bad culture. Our culture is not innovative. Our culture is risk. Our culture is, but where did that culture come from? And my, very basic insight based on my understanding of how organizations work and the literature that has been written about them is that we should see like the foundational elements of the corporation as driving the surface level characteristics. So the little pyramid I drew: accountability, process, culture, people, in that order. That the accountability systems that you drive in the company, the way that people are promoted, compensated, how bonuses work, how funds are allocated between projects, what determines what I call people's career equity, so their sense of future prospects with the organization, how you dole that out absolutely determines which process elements you're going to be able to adopt. So, many of the lean foundational concepts, whether it's Kaizen, Kanban, and Encore, like from traditional lean, or MVP, build, measure, learn, pivots from lean startup, none of those are possible if your accountability systems work against the collaboration and cross-functional nature of those kind of products. So it's like a very basic version of that. And there's a lot, you can see that over and over again. If teams are held accountable to vanity metrics, then they're not going to pivot. They're not going to learn. They're just going to swing for the fences and hope for the best. If you punish productive failures and you don't admire them for the learning that they give, if you don't reward people for designing smart, liability contained experiments, then they're not going to do it. Then so that determines what you can do at the process level. So are you going to be able to work, with an internal startup? Are you going to be able to do minimum viable product? This is true, even if you're a few founders in a garage. If your VCs are telling you to swing for the fences and launch on a certain date, no matter what customers are saying, if you're being required by your legal counsel or who knows what else. I've been in some pretty crazy situations over the years where someone's requiring you to stay in stealth mode, preventing you from talking to customers or getting feedback, then you're certainly not going to do lean startup. But whatever process choices you make, that's what determines your culture. I think this is where people get backwards. Culture is not the posters that you put up on the wall. Your values are not the things you put in the document. Your values are the decisions that you make every day. What's in the muscle memory? How do people go about their work when no one's telling them how to go about their work? That's culture. Well, the way people go about their work is highly dependent on how they were required to do it in the past. So if you have a certain kind of playbook that you do over and over again, people become habituated to working in that way. If you have a siloed process where the people in the different functions have an antagonistic relationship with each other, that feeds on itself. And pretty soon, you don't have to have the process anymore. People will naturally be antagonistic just because they've learned that the people in that other department are bad. And there's tons of fun, famous psychology, sociology. There's even in primatology, they have these experiments where they'll have monkeys in a cage, learn some behavior. Like if you touch a certain lever, like you get some kind of penalty. So pretty soon the monkeys learn to prevent, if any of the monkeys go forward to pull the lever, the other monkeys will grab them and make sure that they don't do it. Well, you then start to rotate out one monkey at a time. So you have 5 monkeys in there, you take one out, put a new monkey in. Now you have 1 and 4. If that one goes for the lever, the others pull them back. And when you keep doing that replacement until now you have 100% new monkeys in the cage, they will still continue to prevent anyone from pulling the lever, even if you disconnect the reward and punishment mechanism from it, because they've just learned this thing that everyone in the environment knows. So like, it's not even a human frailty. It's a primate frailty. We share this problem with our near ancestors, right? So it's like very fundamental to our DNA and how we're wired. And so that you think about a culture in which people are slapped down from taking risks, where people are told to lie about how much failure they have, where there's politics and BS and bureaucracy. What kind of person wants to work in an organization like that?
Exactly.
Right? It starts to attract a certain kind of person, and the whole thing becomes self-fulfilling. So if you want to change the pinnacle of that pyramid, you have to be willing to touch the deep systems at the base.
Yeah, and I think through the experiences that I've had, you hear people say, well, we need to drive for behavior change. We have to drive a new culture, without necessarily considering, to your point, the wrapper that's actually created that culture. And so you want people to behave in one way, but you're actually incentivizing them to behave in a completely different way, which may be counterproductive to the outcome you want to achieve. So it's a huge issue. Let's talk a little bit about some of the concepts in the book, because I know we'll run out of time. Otherwise, there's 3 phases, and the first phase is what you call critical mass, where you determine what's working, what isn't. You're actually looking for proof of concept, if you like. I think it's also where you start small, you test fast, and you're learning not only about what your customers want and need, and you validate that what you think is true, but it's also from an enterprise perspective. I think it's your first opportunity to also learn what's going to stop this train. Like what are those systems and structures, those decision-making processes that we have that are going to throw us off the rail. What do you see as the most important thing to remember for this phase? You know, there may not be a right way, but there's probably a better way to approach it.
Well, yeah, I have to be careful about this, because in writing the book, one of the things I really wanted to do was to show people the patterns that I've observed in 3 different contexts. I got to watch this up close in several mega corp transformations, like GE, you know, like Citi, like Procter and Gamble, you know, you name it. I like Toyota, Intuit, iconic, huge, you know, multinational public companies. I've also seen it up close in the federal government because of my work, which ultimately led to the creation of the United States Digital Service and AT&F, and seeing some of these really massive bureaucracies go through this transformation, as well as I've lived through this in a startup context, where, you know, you start off with just a few people in a garage, but next thing you know, the company is growing and scaling and developing these systems, you know, from scratch. Except this is the thing people forget: they're not from scratch. Because let's say you go from 100 to 1,000 employees in 18 months. I'm thinking of a specific company that went through that. That's the kind of growth we're talking about. Order of magnitude growth in a year, in 2 years. I was once at a town hall meeting at a company like that. And I remember sitting there in the room and I said, okay, everybody raise your hand if you were here when the company was small and scrappy. And, you know, a couple people raise their hand. Okay. Raise your hand if you remember the company struggling to raise money. A couple more people raise their hand. Okay. Raise your hand if you just got here, you know, in the last 6 months or 12 months. And everybody raised their hand. So you're like, oh, where did all those new people used to work? They were the founders of hyper growth startups a minute ago? No, of course not. Just probability speaking, they were all working at big companies. That's all they've ever known. Or maybe they're right out of school if you're lucky. So they bring with them all this inherited baggage, cultural ideas, muscle memory, beliefs about organizational structures that have to be, you have to acculturate them, indoctrinate them into something new. So even in a startup context, the phases are kind of the same. So in the book, I want to say, look, I've noticed these 3 phases kind of play out similarly in these different examples, but this is not a prescription to say you must do what GE did, you must do what Dropbox did, you must do what USDS did, because every organization is different. And a big part of the first phase, this critical mass phase, is discovering what works for this particular organization, which is really challenging. You know, people forget this, that like even at Toyota, it's not called lean manufacturing. They call it the Toyota production system. And if you went to work at Toyota and you came in waving some American book about lean manufacturing, you said, it says in the book that we do this, then we do this, then we do that, they would hit you right upside the head. Well, they're Japanese, so be more polite about it. That would not go very far. They would say, listen, first of all, you're going to learn the Toyota production system. And then if we have a new idea that deviates from orthodoxy, but it works, we're going to incorporate it into the Toyota production system. That's what we do. So that, like, every company has to make these ideas their own. And so the most important work of this first phase is the translation that happens from the like theory of the change to the practice of what it looks like in this particular organization. And it has to be done carefully because, you know, listen, the reason I write books about this is because I do think there's a right way and a wrong way. And I do think the theory is important. And yet, so you can't change, you can't make unlimited changes and expect to get the same results, but especially around things like terminology, the sequence with which concepts are introduced, the tactics that are associated with each concept, those are going to be very different. And in order for the change to be successful, my observation is it has to be seen as indigenous. The other thing I think is important to remember is that a transformation is like a startup. This is one of the controversial ideas in the book. So you should treat the founders of the transformation as distinct from the founders of the individual projects that you're trying to empower, like internal startups. There's kind of like the change agent, like Marilyn. And then there's the people working, for example, at GE on like a diesel engine, on a neonatal incubator, on a, you know, combined cycle power plant product. And then as those products become more varied, as we saw at GE in the first phase, you start to then say, okay, well, here's an IT project that's purely internal. Here's an HR project. Here's a corp dev project. Here's a finance project. So you start to look at internal projects. You start to look at what at GE they call commercial operations. So the way that the sales process unfolds for customers. And then you start to look at regional projects. So what about go-to-market strategies? Like we very famously did a project inside of GE to bring some healthcare products to post-war Iraq. And okay, yes, there's a playbook for what to do if you're bringing a product to a new market. But on the other hand, this is post-war Iraq we're talking about. So like, what are the odds that the playbook is really going to work? Like, this is a very chaotic situation. So of course we're going to have to adapt and change. And so we start to see that project as an internal startup, the leaders of that project as founders, and start to treat them with that kind of entrepreneurial respect. And also we have somebody driving the change for the company who's thinking not just about how to make that project successful, but how to drive the entrepreneurial thinking into the overall structure of the organization. And the claim I make in the book is that all those different kinds of projects should be treated as entrepreneurship, and they should be managed centrally under the auspices of one overarching function. We call it the missing function in most corporations. And that function should just be called entrepreneurship. Like, let's dispense with the formality and the confusion and like, what is this activity? That's what it is.
Yeah, I want to come back to that missing function as well, but let's keep working our way through these phases, because I also think that in phase one, where I see it outside GE as well, is it's also where you really start to come up around some of those assumptions which speak to culture, speak to accountability, that people say, yeah, I love this, but how does it fit into our stage gate process? Or I love this, but how is it going to fit into what we currently have around decision making or funding? And so in phase one, you're really starting to learn what's going to have to change. And that kind of feeds into phase two, which is the scaling up. And again, to what you've just said, there is no right or wrong way. You're not a GE, you're not an Intuit, you're not a P&G. But there are the patterns, whether it's a cohort of coaches, whether it's executive champions, whether it's something else. I've heard a lot of people say, well, we're trying to build grassroots support for lean startup. But I think that's only going to get you so far. So what would you see as being maybe one of the more important pattern elements to consider when you get to phase two?
Sure. So again, the pattern I see is that, like, a common question people ask me is should this change be driven tops down or bottoms up? Should it be a grassroots initiative, or should it be driven centrally? And I think that's a totally normal question, but I actually think the premise of the question is flawed. Because the purpose of grassroots change is to convince senior management to adopt the idea wholeheartedly. So it is both bottoms up and top down. And what you see as things play out over the course of the life of one of these transformations, it tends to kind of bounce. The spotlight tends to be on the grassroots, then it's on the CEO, then it's back on the grassroots, then it's back on the CEO. Because like the problem with saying we're just going to do grassroots change is, well, how is the organization going to judge the success of the grassroots change? If we don't change anything about the accountability system of the company, the grassroots change is going to be eradicated by the middle managers, because they're going to see it as a threat to their orderly process, and they're going to do their job, which is to prevent that from happening. That's the job. So we have to have an agreement with somebody about what success looks like. If it's not senior management, I don't see how it could possibly work. But if you say, well, hold on, well, that means we can't get started until everyone from the CEO on down has already bought off on the change, you have another problem, which is, but the CEO will say, well, how do I know this is going to work? You can't be like, well, I read this great book and I saw this cool webinar, so it's going to work. Like, that's not going to cut it. We have to prove that it works. So like any experiment, we just start with an initial hypothesis that we think this is going to work, get a buy-in with somebody who can defend that experiment against senior management, hopefully a senior leader buy-in, and then work our way up, increasing the scope of the experiment as we get more buy-in, until eventually we get to that decisive moment. Really, that's how I notice you kick off phase two. You have a crisis or some kind of like the healthcare.gov crisis in the federal government, like the decision at GE, the strategic decision by the senior leadership to roll this out company-wide. In a lot of startups, you're talking about the crisis that is caused by product market fit, that, you didn't intend to have a crisis, just like, oh my God, we have to build a full-on standing army all of a sudden because things are down up. So whatever that moment, that catalyst is, that's the moment to kind of use the pre-agreed success criteria with senior management to spring into action and really drive the transformation wide.
Thank you. It's such a partnership or a collaboration at all levels of the organization and across all functions. And so that brings us to phase 3, the second founding, which is obviously where organizations transform those internal processes, those third rail. It's also, I think, and you'll correct me if I'm wrong, where, again, you really want to be looking at that missing function of entrepreneurship.
Sure. So phase 2 is about going wide. Phase 3 is about going deep.
Exactly.
We call them the deep systems of the corporation, the really difficult things to change. Like I talk in the book about when we reformed GE's legendary EMS. Like a very famous, very powerful HR system for reward and promotion. And when we first started working together, you remember, Marilyn?
Oh, yes.
I remember suggesting to people that we change EMS. They were like, it was like I was saying we should change gravity. I mean, like, come on, that's like the third rail. You don't mess with that. That'll never change. Change the values of the company. I mean, for GE, that was like a major step to change how it talks about what its values are, to change how projects are allocated, start doing metered funding through what we call growth boards. These are really difficult changes that require tremendous coordination across functions and buy-in from not just the senior leaders in general, not just the product leaders, but the functional managers. Anyway, it's really difficult. And to say that that's a prerequisite for change would mean there would never be any change. So you have to use the early phases to build up the power. Let's be honest, this is about political power within the organization to make those changes. And the reason I don't mind talking about it that way and being honest about it is that we as a movement are not about political power. We're about scientific truth. So by the time we get to this point, we're going to have this fight over whether we should change these systems or not. It's incumbent on us as the change agents to have developed the proof that it works. And that's ultimately what can break through people's recalcitrance to change. It's like fundamentally people they crave results. So if you can demonstrate that the system you're talking about works and show them the proof points, then you can get through those difficult conversations. It can happen.
It can. And in the example you give with GE around performance management as well, it was also based on from the starting point that we literally applied lean startup to lean startup. And so by having those early project teams, some succeed, some not so much, by understanding that GE as an organization, an enterprise, didn't necessarily have the culture that supported that value of experimentation. And then by recognizing the accountability element, that we had to hold people accountable for those new behaviors, all of those played together into creating that second founding, I think. And of course, having leadership that was willing to take it on board and consider that. We've got a couple of questions in the chat, Eric. So let me take you to those first for the next few minutes. One question says that you've mentioned using Lean Startup in a large government organization with several, really, which is fascinating. Can you talk a little bit more about that? And what do you see of the benefits of doing Lean in the federal government, this kind of dinosaur-sized beast that still has the capacity to change?
Sure. Well, I tell a story in the book. I think it's just this crazy story about a guy named Mikey Dickerson who, was working at Google as like a site reliability engineer, I think. So, like a very basic Google function on the engineering side. And he gets this phone call one day from Todd Park asking if he'll dial into a conference call about the failure of healthcare.gov. Everyone remember when the healthcare.gov website launched? It was a major calamity. It was on TV every day, CNN doing live reports about how the software didn't work. And so Mikey said, sure, Todd Park was the United States CTO at that time. And Mikey knew him from before. He said, sure, I'll hop on a phone call. So he gets up at, 4:00 in the morning the next day to hop on this conference call. And he realized in the course of the conference call that he's not just dialing into a conference call. Secretary Sebelius and the top leadership of the government are talking about the rescue plan for who's going to rescue this site. And Todd Park has said that Mikey Dickerson is going to be on the rescue team. So he's calling in to find out that he's been pledged to solve this problem he knows nothing about. He's like, excuse me, what is this call? And who am I talking to? Is this a prank? What is that? He's like literally going on Wikipedia as people's names get mentioned and being like, oh my God, that person's the Secretary of Health and Human Services. Like, this must be a real call. And anyway, so he shows up in DC, and I tell the story in the book. I won't belabor all the points now, but like the situation was as like it's just such a mess. I can't even get started. Like, he told me this funny story about they had these different ticketing systems that different vendors would use to share tasks with each other. And like through a series of incompetent planning, there were 2 different incompatible ticketing systems, but people didn't realize it. So what would happen is people would issue a ticket that would say database, blah, 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 needs to be replaced with the new version or whatever. And then they would never hear back. And they would just assume that the other person was working on it because it's in the ticketing system. But of course, since there were 2 different ticketing systems, often there's no one on the receiving end of that system. So no one knows, and there's no accountability. It's like, Dilbert could not invent a badly managed situation. And to make a long story short, 6 weeks after he showed up there, they had the site operational. And then, I can't remember, 3 or 4 months after that, it was like, running at capacity. And they basically saved the president's signature initiative at that time. And it was this, and it was a very small team that did it, handful of Silicon Valley and civil servant people. They had been part of a transformation that had been going on for a while, but kind of in that phase 1 critical mass stage. There were these things called Presidential Innovation Fellows who had gone in for tours of duty. There's a woman named Jen Paulka who runs Code for America, who had spent some time working for Todd Park as a deputy CTO. There were a few key people, I try to give credit to them in the book, who had kind of been keeping this flame alive, that using the power of digital technology, we could transform the delivery of services in the federal government, even though it's a massive bureaucracy. And when those people were a part of using these kind of iterative experimental entrepreneurial techniques to save this high profile initiative, it kicked off a massive transformation inside the government, because all these cabinet secretaries and agencies saw that calamity and saw who had fixed it. And then they're like, hey, how do I prevent that from happening to me? And so anyway, I tell that story in the book. I think as a citizen, it makes me feel really good to know that this is going on. And as much as things are our political situation is in dire straits at the moment, from everything I'm hearing, this initiative continues even under the current circumstances. So I'm really proud of that too.
Well, it's something to be proud of for sure. And just kind of a follow-up question from my end, because you do mention, and your hope that this book, The Startup Way, will be read by present and future policymakers. And you also talk about the fact that this is a goal. This goal is about policy and not politics, which kind of reminded me in a backwards way about some of the things you do when you're focused on leadership, and you talk about how your decisions are business, not personal. And so by the same token, we can be making policy decisions without making political decisions. So what do you consider to be some of the critical features of this pro-entrepreneurship public policy? What would you like to see the future being for entrepreneurship in the public arena?
Yeah, thanks for asking me about that, because of course this is a part of the book that's near and dear to my heart. And and made my publisher really nervous to include, because they're like, hey, why are we talking about labor policy and unions and basic income and all that stuff? But I feel like it's part and parcel of the transformation that we're talking about, that we are living through right now a tremendous management revolution. Okay, people talk of it like a technology or digital revolution, which of course that's an important component of it, but like those tools are worthless if we cannot harness them using these managerial techniques. So we're building new kinds of organizations, I think for the first time in human history, organizations that are capable of adapting to future circumstances. And so I don't claim in the book that the Startup Way is the end all be all system of management, but just that it's the first system of management that contains within it the seeds of its own evolution. That I think is its defining feature. But we are not geared up as a society to understand what is it going to mean when those are the kind of organizations that structure our daily life. And in particular, I don't think we do a good job of really getting serious about giving access to entrepreneurial opportunities to every person. So I tried to walk through in the final chapters of the book what is required from a policy point of view for us to be able to say we actually have a pro-entrepreneurship public policy. Now, part of that is what I was just talking about a second ago, using entrepreneurial thinking to drive government outcomes, in procurement, in delivery of services. And there's some wonderful examples that Code for America is doing, like here in the state of California, changing how people access food stamps and how they deal with their, getting their criminal record to be accurate, and all these like very basic mechanics of civil society that if you can do them more efficiently, more effectively, not only do you save money, but you really improve people's lives. At the same time, as policymakers, we have to look at what actually changes the rate of entrepreneurial activity in our society. And we have to admit that even here in the US, the paragon of entrepreneurship in the world, the rate of new business formation is decreasing. The number of public companies is decreasing. That Silicon Valley is being rightly criticized for a number of failings in terms of making opportunity available to all. So we have a series, I make a series of policy, I wouldn't even call them prescriptions, more like provocations, ideas to try out. What could we do to incentivize people to try their hand at entrepreneurship, to make entrepreneurial resources more available, seed capital more available, and then to cushion individuals from the fear they have of failure, of entrepreneurial failure, without creating a moral hazard. So anyway, for people who want the details, they could of course read about it in the book, but I do think this is an important thing for us as a movement to be focused on.
Yeah, and I mean, it's really, in a simple way for me, about pushing this idea of experimentation, being willing to experiment and to learn. Whether it is viewed as a failure or a success, it's still learning. And that's the only way we're going to get better at driving change, whatever change it is we need. We've only got a few minutes left, so let me come back to a couple of questions, maybe from our chat. One person has asked that, to get started, do you suggest to focus on your critical mass in different areas of the business, so maybe different functions or different verticals, or to focus on one to work it out and give some proof of success to the rest?
Sure. I don't think this is an either or, but a matter of sequencing.
Yeah.
The key is whatever experiments you do, make them good. Don't do it halfway. Like that is the number one mistake I make, because I see people make. It's okay. You get a team. You say, we're going to do MVPs and experimentation iterate. We're going to do it lean startup. So the team, but you don't like make any changes. So the team still has to do their regular operational reviews. They're still basically doing the same thing they were doing before, but now they do this extra MVP thing on top of it. And like I know I'm thinking one project in particular. I'm sure Marilyn will know who I'm talking about, where they had they were authorized, they had the budget and they were given permission to do the lean startup thing, but they also had to get like 20 middle managers approval for everything that they did. And every time they met with a middle manager, the plan would get chipped away a little bit and become more closer to, they started out over here with a bold new plan and they just chip. Over the course of a couple of months, they were basically doing the same old thing, but calling it lean startup. And that doesn't help anybody, because when the project finally failed, the people who like lean startup said it was because of the chipping away. And the people that don't like lean startup said it was because of lean startup. And we had no way to adjudicate because we'd only done it halfway. So the successful transformations I see always begin with one or a small number of projects where you really say, look, we're just going to really make an exception this time, really do it differently. And then here's the other key idea. We're going to look for the leading indicators of future success. So we're not going to some people are like, well, why don't I do one project, wait until it makes $100 million, and then I can do the second project. I'm like, well, we don't have that kind of time. Okay? and the laws of probability are not on our side, because you can't, this is not a guarantee. You imagine someone who's like, I'm going to become a professional VC investor. I'm just going to pick one company to invest in, and then I'm going to wait for it to be a success. The problem, like even if you really were good at it, it's just like, God, there's so many things that can go wrong. It's so hard to know. So you have to say, what are the leading indicators that we're willing to look at to go to 2 projects and then 4 projects and then 8 projects? Someone I know we both admire, Mark Little, who was the kind of effectively the company's chief technology officer at GE. I remember very early on, he was a very early skeptic of us doing lean startup, because of course he was the person in the company who owned and was responsible for the operationalizing GE's product development process. So naturally he's going to be a skeptic, but he became an early passionate convert. And one of the things he said to me, I remember really early on, he said, listen, we're doing, I think we had done one project and maybe we're doing 4, maybe we're on our 8th project at GE. So like very early on, we had a handful of, like at the very start of the critical mass. He said, listen, I understand that these projects are not going to be instantaneously successful, but I want to see every project when it goes through this transformation, I want to see an improvement in cycle time. That's what I care about. And I believe that if we improve cycle time, we're going to get a better market outcome. And of course, the trick to it was we had to educate him about how to define cycle time in a new way. It was a huge issue, right? Because if you just improve the technical cycle time of the production process, but like we had one project that, you know, instead of they would come out with a new product like roughly every 5 or 10 years. It was a very slow development process, so they were no rush to get anything done. We said, look, technically speaking, you could get a new product out every year or even twice a year. But because they only did it every 10 years, the commercialization process of how they go to work with the channel partners and get the product displayed and everything, that process alone took 18 months after they were done with the product just to get it in customers' hands. So like if that second part of the cycle time is not included, then it doesn't count. So we had to really like get the company to understand a new definition of cycle time. And then once we did, it was really easy to see the before and after were dramatically impactful. And look, that was 5 years ago now. So the business results, the trailing indicators have long since proven the case. He was right to focus on those leading indicators. But I think that required real conviction on the part of leadership to say, we're willing to say we have a point of view about what the right leading indicators to look at are.
Yeah, no, I remember it very well. And I think the other risk that I see sometimes is when we tell teams, get your experiments good, they hear it as make it perfect.
Right.
Make your MVP perfect, make your experiment perfect. And they use that as a way of slowing down, or they will not pay attention to those leading indicators until they get proof that what they think is true, as opposed to what customers are actually telling them.
I always think about Ben Franklin with the kite?
Yep.
You know, it's like, was that a perfect experiment? Yes. Was it a perfect power plant? No. So like, we want to get the kite version, right? We want to get the experiment to be an effective experiment at learning and effect. Like, and then once you get electrocuted, then you can turn that into a power plant very easily. You know, it's like very simple. I don't know if that's a real story or apocryphal, but I always think that.
It works. With just a couple of minutes left, Eric, you know, I think I've said to you before, I'm a big fan of the book, and I love the way it's laid out. And of course, we always know too, there's a risk that people will think, oh, this looks so easy. And you and I both know, as I'm sure do clients in P&G and Citibank and all those other big companies, it is really, really hard. So what are your last words? Maybe not so much about the easy or hard, but about reality. How do we help people just keep it, for lack of a better word, keep it real?
Keep it real. I mean, I think I say that in the book. I'm like, come on, you know, like, can we just level with each other for a second? I'm not some guru who has magic answers for you and just like, oh, you know, if you follow my formula, you're going to live forever. It's just like, I'm of the Peter Drucker school. He once said, people call me a guru because they can't spell charlatan. So yeah, let's keep it real. And I think, like, speaking as someone who has done both, it is actually more difficult. Like, it's more painful to go out of business than it is to transform. So we was like, oh, transformation is so hard. It's like, yeah, but you know what's harder? Having your company die. So when you're a startup, that's really easy because death is facing you, you know, right there every day. For a lot of managers, it's a little bit more difficult because it's like, look, you inherited this business from somebody else who inherited it from somebody else, and you're going to pass it on to your successor. And let's be honest, the company, even if you make totally incompetent decisions and screw up in every possible way, it's probably not going to kill the company during your tenure. So we have to get a little bit more abstract and say, what do you want your legacy to be? Yeah. Do you want to be remembered as part of the generation that turned this company around and set it on a path to 21st century prosperity? Or do you want to be remembered as part of the as the last generation of managers of this company? And I've been really impressed. The good companies, the good senior leaders, they really care about that question and they take it seriously. And that motivation pushes them through the difficulty when, you know, when reality intervenes.
Well, I think that's a perfect way to end this conversation. Eric, thank you so much for your time today and for being so willing to talk about such varied topics. And Sarah, let me hand it back to you.
Thank you, Marilyn. And thanks to everyone for joining us today. A reminder that Lean Startup Week is less than 3 weeks away. You can catch Eric and Marilyn at their workshop on the Startup Way on October 31st. Space is limited. If you'd like to participate, it's open to the first 200 Gold Pass holders. If you plan on joining us in San Francisco, grab your pass before October 15th to save with our fall sale. Visit 2017.leanstartup.co for more information. Thank you again.